Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a good day. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Roman literature, and we're going to focus some of the authors, a couple of the poets that you're going to be reading and talking about in class over the next couple weeks as we continue to discuss the history and the culture of Rome. So, in recent years, people who think a lot and write a lot about culture have been engaged in a sort of vigorous debate about the relationship between art and politics. And if you take just a quick glimpse at some of the headlines emerging out of this debate, you'll see things like this. Is political art the only art that matters now? Is all art political? And even liberals are killing art. Hardly a week goes by without comment on a new book or a new movie or a song that steps into the political realm, that touches on some political issue or some contemporary hot button topic. And some people will praise these artists for their courage to tackle these issues, while others will lament the fact that everything is getting too political, that they can't even go to the movie theater anymore without thinking about issues like racism or corruption or injustice. Now, while you may have your own opinions about the place of politics in art or the place of art in politics, and while it's important to note that the internet abounds with these articles and opinion pieces and rants, these things aren't new. You've already spent several weeks studying works and looking at works like the Enuma Elish, or Hammurabi Stela, or Antigone. And so you know that artistic expression and political power have demonstrated this close and sometimes uneasy relationship for thousands upon thousands of years. This is a reality that leads to all different kinds of political expressions, from artists of all different political leanings. For every work that gives hope to the oppressed or brings to the forefront some crucial issue that needs to be brought into the light, there's another artist that's all too willing to engage in propaganda on behalf of the powers that be. And so in many cases, the question isn't whether art is political or whether art should be political, but rather what forms this relationship between art and politics might take. Well, today, as we continue our exploration of ancient Roman culture, we're going to be talking about Roman literature. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Roman literature as it existed at a specific time and place in the history of Rome. We're going to be talking about the period known as Augustan literature. Now, it's important to note here at the outset that there are actually two periods in literary history that are classified as Augustan. The first one is the one we'll be talking about today. It refers to the flourishing of literature, primarily poetry, which took place during the time leading up to and including the reign of Octavian, or Caesar Augustus. Now, there's a later period in British literature in the 18th century that also goes by the name, the Augustan period, or Augustan literature. And that's because the poets of that period, such as Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope, some writers that you'll be learning about in sophomore humanities, were self-consciously imitating some of the conventions and embracing some of the ideas that they saw in the poetry of Augustan Rome. So that gives us some idea of Augustus's influence on literature. Most rulers don't even have one period named after them, and Augustus got two. So we're going to be looking at for the next few minutes at what it might have meant during the period when Augustus was coming into power to be an Augustan poet. As we do, we're going to be looking at the lives and works of a couple of poets whose work you'll be reading in class, and asking the question, what makes these writers Augustan? In other words, in what sense were their poems and their life stories bound up with the historical and political period in which they created their masterpieces? How does the time and place in which they wrote help us to understand the poetry that they produced? As we begin to reflect on the influence that a leader like Augustus would have had on the literature of his time, we want to start by looking at one of the central qualities of Roman literary culture. In fact, it's an important trait of Roman culture in general, stretching back all the way to the time of the Republic. I'm talking about patronage. You've already read briefly about the role that the patron-client relationship played in the early days of Roman society. A wealthy, well-connected individual would enter into a mutually beneficial agreement with a number of clients, and he would provide kindnesses to these people, either by giving them material goods, or by helping them acquire social capital, such as employment in desirable positions, or maybe just getting them out of a jam when they needed it. And in turn, the client would offer support and loyalty and services to the powerful person they were attached to. One scholar has said of this patron-client system, it was the cement that bound Republican society. So this was an idea that had a long and respected history in Rome. And even when the Republic was replaced by new forms of government, this idea persisted. So you could still find people who had achieved a certain position of wealth and power and wanted to use that position to help others find their place in society. Among these, a number of patrons were particularly interested in the cultural life of Rome, and they sought to advance promising young artists, especially poets, in their careers. So it's important to remember that the literary culture of Rome was different from what we're used to seeing in our day and age. This was before the printing press, let alone before mass productions of texts and film versions of novels. This was before agents and publishing companies and all of the other elements that make it possible, even if it's difficult, for a writer to make a living off of his or her craft. So if a poet wanted to benefit in any kind of material way from their writing, then in Rome they would be dependent on the generosity of a patron. And in some cases, a patron might give a writer whose work he admired a post of some sort. Maybe they would give the writer an honorary job that would pay a little bit of money, and this would sort of free the writer up to have money and time to write. In other cases, the kindnesses of the patrons could be even more lucrative. There's evidence that some Roman poets were given large estates by patrons who wanted to do something very generous to honor the artist's talent. But even beyond material or financial gifts, the patron would also introduce the poet to his circle of friends. So the writer would have a network of people who would listen to his work and give him the kind of recognition that artists want, and also help in some ways to advance their career. And in return for all this support, well, what could the patron expect to get? Well, this is where things get kind of interesting. For some wealthy patrons, it was simply exciting to be in a position where you'd have a smart, talented person for a friend. Part of the thrill for a patron was getting to hang out with someone whose work they admired. This is something that we can probably all relate to, even if we're not a Roman. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle observed that well-off people might not need much in life, but they do enjoy having witty companions. They like being around people who are fun to be around. In other cases, these patrons valued their relationships with poets because they knew that the poets could make them famous by including them in their poems. Some patrons imagined that long after they were dead, future generations would see their names preserved in the works of the poets that they had kept in their circle. And so in this way, a good poet could make his patron immortal. But even before they were dead, these patrons understood that a talented writer could make their name known among other important people. So a poet, if he were so inclined, could function as a kind of public relations person for a patron who might have a lot of money, might have more wealth than he knew what to do with, but wanted to be spoken well of, wanted to have a good reputation to match his economic status. So the patronage system, while it came to be simply a part of the literary culture of ancient Rome, also could pose some challenges for the poets. First of all, serious poets had to retain some measure of credibility. So these poets couldn't be seen to be too enthusiastic in their support of the patrons, or else they'd be accused of simply courting the favor of a wealthy individual at the expense of their art. Today, we might call this selling out. To take one example of this, we have a poem from an anonymous poet to a well-known patron named Messala. And this poem from the anonymous poet to Messala includes these opening lines. He says, "Let me sing of you, Messala, though your acknowledged valor holds me in awe. Even if my weak powers may not be able to sustain it, I shall begin. If you should praise my poems by their own merits, they would fail. Let me be merely a recorder of your mighty feats." And then the poet goes on to compare Messala, his patron, to legendary heroes like Nestor and Ulysses. He recounts his patron's great exploits on the battlefield. He even makes prophetic proclamations of future victories that Messala will win. He talks about triumphs that Messala will enjoy in Gaul and in Spain and even in the southern hemisphere. Then the poet ends by saying that when he dies, he wants to be reincarnated as a horse, and then a bull, and then a bird, and finally as a human, so that he can once again sing praises to Messala. In other words, this poet is laying it on a bit thick. It's pretty clear that the poet is really kind of trying to hit Messala up for money or land. And there's probably a reason why we don't know this poet's name. Messala might have enjoyed this praise for a little while. He might have enjoyed having this poet around singing his praises. But even he would have been able to see through the act. He would have been able to realize that this poet wasn't actually any good. And so he would have cut him loose. If a poet was going to win the favor of a patron and still be seen as a worthy artist, he was going to have to be a bit more subtle in his praise. Now, a second challenge for the poet was deciding who to seek patronage from. In the years leading up to the reign of Augustus, there were a number of wealthy patrons who could be seen to be of service to a poet. These included politicians and other important and wealthy people. Sometimes these well-connected individuals competed with one another for the attention of artists. And sometimes these individuals could go from a position of wealth and power one day to a position of relative disgrace rather quickly. It wouldn't do a poet much good to be connected to someone who was about to experience a negative turn, a downfall, maybe a very public one. So it was important for a poet not to make the wrong alliances. It was important for a poet to seek out the right kinds of patrons. Poets who wanted to seek patronage would have to play the field with a certain level of shrewdness, discerning who would be the best person to endear oneself to, so that they could advance their career. However, after the Battle of Actium, which you read about earlier this week, where Antony was decisively defeated, after the Second Triumvirate collapsed, when it became clear that Octavian was going to be the undisputed ruler of Rome, there wasn't much room for other patrons. Even in cases where other wealthy individuals with connections to the throne continued to support poets, it was important to keep in mind that at this point in time, in the 1st century BC, the ultimate patron, the one whose favor mattered more than anyone else's, was Octavian's, Caesar Augustus himself. And if poets saw that obtaining the favor of Augustus would be favorable to their career, well, it also became clear to Augustus and to his closest advisors that bringing poets into their sphere of influence could benefit him as well. Augustus, as you've already begun to learn, was someone who was very interested in getting his message, his agenda out there. He was very interested in sharing the values that he wanted to promote. Now today, when politicians want to promote their message, it's obvious what they do. They dash off a tweet. Maybe if they're really serious about it, they go on TV and make a speech. But in Rome, in the 1st century, they didn't have Twitter. They didn't even have TV. So Augustus had to craft his image in other ways. And he realized, shrewdly, that cultivating relationships with artists, sculptors, architects, and poets was a good way to do this. So with all of that context in mind, let's talk briefly about two of the most famous Augustan poets. And let's reflect briefly on how they fit into their time and place. First, we'll look at Virgil. Virgil was born in 70 BC in Cisalpine Gaul, which is a region in what is now northern Italy. So if we think about the time that Virgil was born, we'll see that he was a young man in his mid-20s when the tumultuous final days of the Republic came to an end in the rise and rapid fall of Julius Caesar. As a lot of writers on Virgil have pointed out, this context probably had a great deal to do with how Virgil's work took shape and what was important to him. Following Julius Caesar's assassination, when the future of Rome was still very much uncertain, Virgil began writing, and he started with a series of poems called the Eclogues, which are Virgil's first major work. The word eclogues means something like selections. And when Virgil wrote this collection of poems, he was working according to a Greek model. a Greek poet named Theocritus, writing about 200 years before Virgil, had popularized a form of literature known as bucolic poetry. He used Homeric form, so the same kind of form that Homer wrote in, but not to write about Homeric heroes or epic themes, but to write about shepherds. And this was a way of using simple characters and settings to reflect on the daily activities, the day-to-day triumphs and trials of shepherds in the fields. In his own eclogues, Virgil wrote about shepherds, but he also wrote about life in Rome, just after the end of the Republic. In some cases, he even alluded to some of the political events that were transpiring. He published these poems, he published the eclogues in 38 BC, and he became a kind of overnight sensation. This new celebrity brought Virgil into the circle of some of the most prominent literary patrons, and these patrons would eventually introduce him to Octavian. Over the next several years, Virgil worked on his second major collection of poems, which was called the Georgics. The Georgics was a collection roughly 2,000 lines long, divided into 4 books, and it was about farming. It reads like a sort of handbook for the soldier who wants to work the land. One of its most famous books primarily focuses on beekeeping. Now, it might strike you as odd that Virgil, this poet who was trying to make his way in the literary world, who was trying to associate with influential patrons, who was schmoozing with political figures and the wealthy people of the Rome of his time, that he would spend so much time writing poems about shepherds and farmers and beekeepers. But there are 2 things to keep in mind. First, just like his first collection, the Eclogues, the Georgics were also based on a Greek work, specifically on Hesiod's poems, Works and Days. And this was a work that had romanticized the agricultural life. Now, second, and probably more important, in writing these poems about soldier farmers, Virgil was lifting up the central ideal figure of the Republic, a person like Cincinnatus, someone who loved the land but would set aside his plow for the good of Rome. These ideas would have been pretty popular during the time when Virgil was writing, when the new leaders of Rome, Octavian and his cohort, would have wanted to project the image that they were restoring Rome to its glory days, that they were returning Roman society to that noble time before things like political corruption and civil war messed everything up. Virgil is thought to have read selections from these poems directly to Octavian in 30 BC, just after Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide and essentially made Octavian the ruler of the Roman world. One of the passages in Book 3 of the Georgics lays out what Virgil's poetic ambitions for the near future look like. He writes, "Yet soon I will gird myself to celebrate the fiery flights of Caesar, to make his name live in the future." And so Virgil made it clear in this earlier work that he wants to use his poetry to elevate the family of his most powerful patron, the man who will soon be called Caesar Augustus. And to do so, Virgil is going to turn his talents to the most important, most respected genre of poetry in the ancient world. And that, of course, is the epic. So having published 2 major works in 2 different genres, it remains for Virgil to try his hand at the epic. And given the time period, and given the connections that he had, especially his connection with this new ruler of Rome, Octavian, Caesar Augustus, everything was setting up nicely for Virgil to write the great epic of Roman history. In 27 BC, he began work on an epic in the Homeric style that would not only narrate the events of the founding of Rome and in all the grandeur that a lover of Homer could expect, but would also situate the Julian family, the line of Caesars, as major players in this legendary history. As if that weren't enough, the Aeneid would also highlight a number of the values that Augustus prioritized in his early rule, in his program of returning Rome to its glorious days, to the glorious days of its Republican past. As you'll see when you read portions of this work this week, Aeneas, the hero of the epic, exhibits a lot of those Roman values. He is devoted to the gods. He is devoted to his family. And most of all, he is devoted to the idea of founding a civilization that would one day rule the world. In at least a few spots within the narrative, Virgil makes it clear that his characters are prophesying about the golden age that he himself is living in, that Aeneas is looking forward to a time when Caesar Augustus is on the throne, and when Rome is occupying its rightful spot among the kingdoms of the world. It's hard to argue with this picture of what it means to be an Augustan poet, a skilled writer using his gifts to pay tribute to his ruler and to articulate his ruler's vision for Rome. If Virgil weren't such a good poet, this would probably come across as blatant propaganda. As it is, it's safe to say that Virgil was the sort of poet that Augustus would want in his corner. When Virgil died in 19 BC, at least according to some scholars, his poem was unfinished, or at least not in its final form. Nevertheless, Augustus and the people close to him made sure that it was published. And this was a move which not only ensured that people would get to read about all the wonderful things that Virgil wrote about Augustus, it was also a move which would also make Virgil not just famous in Rome, but world famous, as the Aeneid became one of the most widely read poems in the ancient world, and even into the medieval world as well. Well, if Virgil enjoyed the favor of his most famous patron until his death, and even beyond his death, the same can't be said for the second poet we'll be looking at today. Ovid can rightly be called an Augustan poet, but maybe for a different reason than Virgil can. Ovid grew up in the Augustan age. He was born in about 43 BC. So by the time Ovid was a teenager, the matter of who would rule Rome in the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination was all but settled. So Ovid didn't have some of the same memories of the chaotic, uncertain political context that had marked Virgil's early adulthood. When Ovid first started writing, he was very young, probably 17 or 18 years old. This was around the time that Virgil was working on the Aeneid, so patrons, especially those with connections to Augustus, were on the lookout for poets who would bring glory to Rome. Ovid's father seems to have wanted him to be a politician, but ironically, as Ovid was becoming an adult, poetry was actually a better career choice for him, perhaps. Like Virgil, Ovid published some works in other genres before tackling his epic. The first of these early works of Ovid is entitled the Amores. You can probably guess what kinds of poems these are. They're love poems. Specifically, they're 50 poems about poetry and love, about the poet's understanding of love. They talk about every conceivable aspect of being in love, from the overwhelming emotion of being hopelessly head over heels, to the lengths one will go to in order to win his love, and so on. In his second work, the Heroides, or the Heroines, Ovid is somewhat more original. Instead of working with an established form or tradition, he invents something more creative. These poems are structured like letters. They're letters written by women, usually women from mythology. And they're written to the men they love, expressing their anguish at being separated from the object of their affections. So included in these poems is a letter from Penelope to Odysseus, one from Ariadne to Theseus, one from Dido to Aeneas, and a number of others. In this collection, we see Ovid working with some of his favorite themes, love and mythology. We also see him constructing vivid characterizations like those that we'll see in his epic. Ovid's other works during the most productive part of his early career were collections like the Ars Amatoria, which tutored readers in the art of seduction, and the Remedia, which is basically a handbook for how to get over being dumped. So, as you can probably tell, Ovid is decidedly not an Augustan poet in the same way that Virgil had been. While he was shaped in the context of Augustan Rome, his approach to poetry and the playful way that he wrote about institutions like marriage and family weren't exactly as earnest as what we read in Virgil. This is also true of his epic, the Metamorphoses. One scholar describes the Metamorphoses as an epic on a majestic scale that refuses to take epic seriously. The work is vast. It recounts mythological history from the creation of the world to Augustan Rome. It takes readers across Asia, Africa, and Europe, and ultimately it tells some 250 stories. But if the main focus of Virgil's epic is Virgil's epic is the order and stability that the family of Caesars brought to Rome and by extension to the world. The theme of Ovid's epic, as the title suggests, is change. The changes that the individual characters go through, but more than that, the changes that the world has gone through since creation. In this way, the Metamorphoses offers this amazing, all-encompassing view of life itself, seen through the lens of mythology. So while Ovid's talent was indisputable, he was not necessarily the advocate for Augustan values that Virgil had been. And perhaps for this reason, his relationship with some of his important patrons, including Augustus, was a bit more rocky. Sometime around 8 CE, when Ovid was about 50 years old, he was banished from Rome. And when I say he was banished from Rome, he was truly banished. He was sent to live near the Danube River in modern-day Romania, a region where winters were cold and where, frankly, there wasn't much to do. For someone used to living in the middle of the action, in the heart of the Roman Empire, this was a serious punishment. We don't know the exact reasons why Ovid was banished, but Ovid cryptically wrote in an autobiographical work that he was being punished for a song and a mistake. It could be that one of his poems angered Augustus. It could be that his work was seen to be encouraging loose morals, or at least making fun of rigorous morality, at the time when Augustus wanted his subjects to live according to the strict ways of the old republic. Some scholars have speculated that maybe Ovid knew too much about a scandal that Augustus's daughter had gotten caught up in. Whatever the reason, Ovid never got to return to Rome, no matter how much he pleaded. He died after about a decade in exile. So we have these two poets, Virgil and Ovid, and both benefited from the patronage that existed under Augustus. Both of them wrote poetry that endured and came to represent the best literature of their time. But while Virgil died in his patron's good graces, Ovid demonstrates the danger of being a poet out of step with those who hold power. But both of these poets spoke to the Augustan age, especially in their epics. Virgil focused on order and stability after a period of turmoil, and Ovid focused on themes of change, as if to emphasize the new ways that Augustus was shaping the world through his rule. And both of these poets show that the union between politics and art isn't new, and that this union between politics and art has been shaping the work of even the greatest artists for a very long time. Thank you.